Hey team, you're about to experience my interview with James Taylor. James is the founder and CEO of Particular Audience, and this is the second time we've had James on the pod. We had him on the pod for episode 120 back in March of 2022, so go and listen to that episode for the background to this episode. We've got James back on the podcast to talk about all of the new AI features and functionality that they have added to the search, merchandising, and personalization technology within Particular Audience. It was a fascinating conversation, and I hope you enjoy it. This is the E-commerce Edge podcast with your host, Jason Greenwood. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the podcast. We have a gentleman that is making his second appearance on the podcast. In fact, I think from memory, he is only the third guest we've ever had more than one time on the podcast. So welcome, James Taylor, back to the podcast.
Thank you, Jason. Very awesome to be back.
It is awesome to have you back. And if we go back to this was a while ago that we had you on now. We had you way back in March of 2022, episode 120, talking e-commerce customer experience personalization. And of course, we were talking primarily about your platform, Particular Audience. And you reached out to me, which was awesome to actually see. You reached out and you sent me a very excited email. And you basically said, look, we've introduced this new technology into the platform that I think is super cool, that I think is pretty groundbreaking. And I'd love to come on the podcast and talk about it. So that's why we're sitting here again today.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Jason. I suppose when we spoke last time, we just raised a round of capital, and I think the markets were probably, so it was March 2022?
Yeah.
Yeah, so just at the sort of, as they started
to peak.
Really
yeah, that was when the market was still very ebullient, is what I would say.
Yeah, definitely.
The market was actually probably just coming to its senses, to be honest. I would say that sort of around the end of 2021, things were still pretty fluffy and pretty frothy. And then early in 2022 is, I think, when the market started to get a little bit more of a dose of reality and valuation started to come down. Securing capital started to become a hell of a lot harder. I know because I was consulting to some businesses and also consulting to some VCs doing some due diligence on, hey, where should we put our money next? What's the next big thing? And things got a whole lot harder. I definitely noticed a sentiment change in the market starting in the beginning of 2022. There was definitely still money around, sloshing around in the industry. I think if we look at as 22 rolled on, definitely the market just contracted more and more, particularly as I think central banks came to the realization maybe we left the punch bowl out a little bit too long.
Yeah. And I think as well in e-commerce, you had probably even before the market started to correct, they had their post-COVID hangover. You had, especially like the big furniture, the big box retailers that were having the delayed stock all arriving just after consumer demand had dropped off. That bullwhip effect of inventory, cash being tied up, and then consumer confidence dropping off. And then as interest rates started to pump up, people stopped spending as much. And I think the stats last year I was looking at, especially in the UK, they had an increase in total dollar in e-commerce, but not in volume. So symptomatic that the price of goods is going up. People have actually bought less overall, but the actual pound amount of sales had gone up. So a bit of a different scenario to the excitement we had through COVID. And I think maybe there were some people that thought that growth would continue ad infinity, but definitely a reversion to the mean.
And I think you raise a really good point. Sorry to interrupt. I think you raise a really good point, which is that a lot of brands, I've seen some brands just talking, for example, on social media, we're up 15% on revenue versus the prior year, but they never ever talk about unit volume. So I always take, in a high inflation, high interest rate environment, I always take growing revenue numbers with a very large pinch of salt, because everybody's revenue numbers are going to be going up. If we have anywhere in the world at any given point in time over the last 2 years, if we had circa 9% inflation, if your revenue isn't going up at least by 9% per year, then your revenue actually isn't increasing. Because if you're not increasing at least at the rate of inflation, then you're actually dropping in revenue. And you most certainly, if you're going up in revenue, but you're not going up in unit sales, then you're most likely going down in profitability. And so the reality is, I think that there's, what do they say? Lies, damn lies, and statistics. So you can make statistics say anything. anything you want them to say. And I think a lot of e-commerce brands, particularly when they were out there trying to raise money, they were really focusing on revenue. They had zero focus on profitability. We look at a tremendous number of the direct to consumer brands that either outright went out of business once people started going back to physical retail, or they took a severe haircut in terms of valuation. And we even look at the big boys and girls like Allbirds of the world that took on massive investment as one of the poster children for strong D2C brands during COVID, and they've never been profitable. And the reality is so many D2C brands, particularly those that were born during COVID in particular, once the TAM went back to a normal level post-COVID, a whole lot of unsustainable businesses were caught with their pants down, and a lot of them just went away, and we just haven't heard from them again. And so I think it's an interesting point you raise, which is that your technology in particular, I think and we'll get into the tech and we'll get into the adaptive transformer search. We'll talk about that more because I think that's important. But I think it's important, or maybe even more important, to put it within the context of what technologies like yours do for a brand. What does it do? What is the end result that we're trying to achieve here, which is ultimately, I think, reduce friction across the entire path to purchase, personalize it a little bit more, increase the AOVs, even if it's only marginally, even if it's only 10%. That's a hell of a lot spread out across all of the acquisitions that you're paying for. And then obviously, if people are having a fantastic experience with a brand, then hopefully that's creating an LTV that people want to come back and buy over and over again. So for me, I think of technologies like yours, which is broadly speaking personalization, personalized experience technology. I think of that as something that creates stickiness in a perfect world with the customer. Is that kind of how you view yourselves in the space?
I think the word you used, friction, is the biggest one as well. You can almost look at personalization as just taking away friction, right?
Yep.
What is every single monetary inch that you can take to make it easier? This isn't just about increasing sales on one website, right? It's like, how do we grow e-commerce? You talk about that TAM. How do we grow that? Yes, basket size. Yes, conversion. But just a better, trustworthy, easier, simple experience that even my grandmother can comfortably achieve on the internet. She refuses to use. But
I love it. And the great thing I think about personalization has always felt like a little bit of a double-edged sword to me in e-commerce, just because it is the holy grail, but also there's this desire by brands to preserve the opportunity to surprise and delight customers throughout the customer journey and introduce new products maybe that have dropped since the last time the customer shopped. Also hyper personalized, but then you've got scenarios where maybe a customer is buying a gift on behalf of someone else. And so they're browsing categories that maybe they've never browsed before because they're browsing sizes and colors of things that maybe they've never browsed before because they're buying for someone other than themselves. There's this tension within the personalization world between, hey, we want to delight our customers and we present new things and we want to be able to effectively upsell and cross-sell and we want to be able to expand the basket, but we also want to create an experience that, again, we're removing friction between the point of consideration and the point of actually getting a product into the cart and getting them to the checkout to whip out their credit card and spend money. So there is this tension. And I think the other tension that is developed in the market, and I'm sure you're seeing it too, is that it feels like everybody and their brother has come out with quote unquote AI-driven personalization technology, right? I think almost every single tech platform in the last 6 months has tried to slap AI somewhere in their name to try to capture the fetish that VCs now have with anything related to AI and the potential opportunity that presents. And so I think there's more competition in the personalization space than ever before, but it's probably more misunderstood than ever before. And because there's so much competition in the space, for merchants themselves, regardless of how much money they have to spend on personalization technology, they're going out there and they're just shaking their head. Where do I even begin? How do I even vet this personalization technology to even know which one to consider?
Yep. Yeah, totally. I think you also hit the nail on the head when you talked about the changing context. If I'm searching for stuff for me versus if I'm searching for a gift, it doesn't matter who I am if I'm on the lookout for that gift. Like, what is relevant to that discovery? And personalization in many circles, I think, has become a bit of a dirty word. I think that relevance is what you're looking for here, or that reduction of friction. You know, what we would have spoken about when we last chatted was personalization isn't actually about you. Like, you're not your demographic. You're not the tenuous few data points that a website can get on you. Those are really bad data points to try and predict your next action on. The analogy I always provide is if you're listening to a hip hop playlist on Spotify, when that playlist finishes, the music that's going to continue playing to you is going to be relevant to that context that you have. But if you're listening to classical music over the weekend, it's going to be a vastly different set of recommended songs back of that. So it's really important to understand that context. How do you do that? It's actually understanding the relationship between items. It's the relationship between entities. If you look at items 1, 2, 3, we know you're going to look at item 4 because a million people
just did that. Or even if it's not a product, even if the entity is a category, for example, and your technology, for example, if I know that I'm on a fashion website and 9 times out of 10, I go from the shoes category to the socks category, or 99% of customers, that's the journey that they take, then if I'm in the shoes category, then presenting me and showing me a sample of recommended products that are sock products would make a hell of a lot of sense. Or making it easy to access that socks category with less friction is going to make a hell of a lot of sense, because what you're doing is you're effectively saying the wisdom of the crowd trumps everything. And if 99% of people do this thing and take this behavior after doing this previous thing, then it's probably a good bet that the vast majority of people are going to continue doing that thing.
Yeah, humans have got a great knack to get around shortfalls in metadata. But if you don't have enough behavioral data or engagement data or purchase data on items, then you do need the computer vision. You do need the natural language processing to identify which items are visually similar to what you've been looking at or have similar attributes for you to compare. And it's really interesting what you say about the category approach. If you were to go to chrisshop.com, which is Singapore Airlines loyalty point store, if you look at their brand menu, it's pretty much alphabetical. But if you go and look at whiskey products, for example, when you go back to the brand menu, Suntory and Cavalan and all those are actually ranking top. Better yet.
Wow. So that's dynamic categorization, personalized, dynamic menuing based on the experience that person is initiating across the site.
Exactly. It's all applications for this vector understanding of the relationship between items. And I see that you engage in some behaviors. I can then correct the rank order, which everything comes down to ranking, of whether it's categories or subcategories or brands or products, search results. It's all how we're ranking and personalization.
And if we even think about ChatGPT, isn't that effectively what prompt engineering is? We're doing prompt engineering on a website just by navigating it in the way that we would normally logically navigate it. We're actually doing prompt engineering without realizing it. So if I'm on ChatGPT today and I ask it a question and it gives me a pretty good answer, but it's not 100% what I was looking for, then I'll refine the question, I'll rephrase it in a different way, I'll copy and paste part of the answer, and then I'll qualify that question with a clarifying question. It feels like that's what we're doing in real time across most websites, but we just don't call it that. We don't call it prompt engineering, but that's actually what we're doing. And effectively what you're saying is we should treat it like prompt engineering, and the way that someone prompt engineers is unique to that individual, but there are patterns that we can recognize across cohorts of individuals, and we should recognize those patterns and present those patterns as if we have to make some assumptions, right? In order to create a great experience, we have to make certain assumptions. But those assumptions are completely data informed based on the behavior of potentially hundreds of thousands of people before them doing something very similar.
And it's exactly that same concepts in the technology, right? This sentence transformer, this thing that many people think, what's a sentence transformer? Like, we're hearing them spoken about more, and my new search product is called Adaptive Transformer Search. What is this transformer? It's not a car that turns into a machine.
Although that would be cool. That would be a major selling point.
Also cool. You get this. Here's a Mustang.
Yeah.
The sentence transformer is effective at predicting what character or word is going to come next in a sentence. It understands the context of the words in a sentence. It's really, really good at understanding search intent, for example, because if you type in designer handbag, it's very different to if you type in handbag designer, right? You're looking for very different things with those search terms. And you can extend that to the conversational inputs of ChatGPT or prompt engineering, as you put it, because you're understanding how to ask things in a way that are going to return results. But the ChatGPT results is just prediction of next character. It's just understanding with that recall of what's already been written out, what's going to come next in its response. Now, You compare that to the e-commerce example that you talk about, like we've just spoken about explicit inputs, like I'm putting text into a box, I'm telling it something. Exactly as you say, it's the implicit actions that you have on an e-commerce website. It's the sequence that help us start to understand what you're probably going to do next. You can still use that transformer technology for recommendation and other approaches to prediction.
And I've likened prompt engineering to being an expert Googler, right? That whole prompt engineering title, that job role, you can see it. You can look across Seek. You can look through across any job website at any given point in time. And there's anywhere from 50 to 1,000 prompt engineering roles available across many different companies. I liken it to, you used to, back when Google was new, you could put something on your CV like expert Googler, and that actually meant something, right? Nowadays, everybody is expected to be an expert Googler, and if you don't know how to use Google, then you probably don't deserve to be anywhere near an office of any variety. You probably deserve to be doing something else. And I feel like prompt engineering, yeah, if you can't articulate what you're looking for, then that's probably a bad sign. And I feel like prompt engineering is eventually going to get to the same place, because I feel like two things are going to happen. One is people will, and we saw this with Google, you learned very quickly how to phrase your questions in a certain way that Google would give you the best response. Now, Google also improved over time, but everybody's use of the platform just got so much better. I remember, and oh my God, this is dating myself, this is freaking embarrassing, but I remember when Google first started to become popular and it started to be everywhere, and you started to use the verb Googling something, right, as a verb as opposed to a proper brand name. It's almost like using the term Kleenex instead of tissue. And I remember in the very beginning how I was actually not a great Google question asker. And I remember thinking at the time, this search engine isn't that much better than Lycos or InfoSeek or Ask Jeeves. I just remember thinking, it's not that special. Like, it's not that good. But once I started to figure out how I should phrase my questions for Google, then I started to realize just how good the Google results were versus its competitors. But Google had to train me, not vice versa. And if
you think about it, also the website owners and the content creators were on the other side of the fence thinking, how do we structure this content to speak to Jason, right?
Yeah, based on the queries that we can see him making and all the query data that we have access to, which you don't have access to anymore, not to that same degree. And so I think everybody, it was almost like a three-sided marketplace, right? You had Google trying to improve their technology. You had the searchers trying to get better results, and so basically feeding both sides with data. And then you had the people trying to present the data and them wanting to give a great experience and have their content get found. So there was actually three parties that wanted you to get a great experience and a great result. And that ultimately made the product better pretty damn fast.
Compensating for the shortfalls in the technology, right? People came together. I want my content found. You want to find the content. Okay, and then Google's doing this additional proxy on how do we know what ranking is going to be best? Let's just see which pages are linking to each other, and then we'll just get everyone trying to link to each other. So it just becomes this like hodgepodge of rules. It's not a humanistic way to search and discover, like in a conversation that you'd have with someone very knowledgeable about the topic.
And I think that's the next great iteration of AI. So at the moment, it's one-dimensional in the sense that it's almost one-directional in the sense that I have to give it a prompt, and it's going to maybe give me an answer that it thinks is the best using the large language model that it has access to. It's going to give me, based on a probabilistic nature of what I'm going to ask next or want to hear next, it's going to put together a string of words and sentences that it should make sense to me as a native English speaker. The problem I have is that when you and I have this kind of conversation, that's not how our brains work, right? When you're speaking, I not only hear the words that you're actually saying, but I also understand much more of the intent behind it, and I'm able to follow up automatically with qualifying questions and statements that get you to expand automatically in a conversational way. And AI doesn't yet do that. For example, it doesn't come back to me before it gives me a response and say, oh, I think you probably want to hear a bit more about this. However, I've got 3 questions for you that will help me give you a better answer. It doesn't do that yet. It's not by direct.
Yeah, I think where it is, if you compare it to previous keyword search approaches, you're literally just doing exact token matching, right? So if I type in designer handbag or handbag designer, that won't necessarily change the ranking of results relative to whatever my intention was based on designer handbag or searching for handbag designer. But with transformers, we are actually able to understand what is the sort of weighting of different words in a sentence and what is the order. Like these queries and these technologies at least have now the self-attention. They can actually understand which are the words that matter, which you can discard, and what the order of the words in the sentence tend to mean. And that's what's already helping make a huge difference in search response and things like ChatGPT.
Okay, so you got your new technology is called adaptive transformer search. Now, I've got a few questions that leap to mind immediately. One is, have you trained your large language model on a generalized third-party data set, for example, combined with your own unique data set internally? Or have you trained it solely on an internal data set? And which large language model are you using? Are you using an open source large language model? Are you using ChatGPT as the base and the API connector? Tell me a little bit more about how you arrived at where you're at today.
Yeah. So it's definitely not a layer on top of ChatGPT. I think ChatGPT included, everything starts with Google Transformers, BERT, right? Like that is just the foundation for large language technology. We're no different. Now, if you try and stick that type of technology onto a website and just hope that it operates in the same experience that ChatGPT or the search results that you might expect, it won't work. You have to do pretty comprehensive vertical tuning on top. So when you think about vertical tuning, a good analogy I like to give is if you're searching for chip on a grocery store versus a hardware store, there's vastly different context. You can't just use the same model.
Yes.
Within our transformers, we are vertically got models that we are tuning for specific verticals. And you can even generate, and the way that you can further tune that is by finding query click pairs. So you can go across whether it's third-party data sets, open source data sets, or your own data, and you can start to interpret when people search for something in a given context, what are they then clicking on? And that can actually bring the query and the result closer to each other in vector space, which is just a technical way of saying that we understand their relationship and their relationship gets stronger as we know. The actual game changer.
Query and action. Query and action. They're tightly correlated.
Exactly right. Exactly right. And the thing that has made the sort of difference that makes ATS, the Adaptive Transformer Search product, so incredibly effective is actually then learning in a local implementation. So from a specific website, we can ingest the query click pair data of their user search queries and what their users are then clicking on to further shift the vector space and the understanding of the relationship between queries and items specific to their website. So it's learning all the time. It's learning based on changing consumer behaviors. And if I'm searching for before Christmas and after Christmas, it's going to sort of shift that vector space relative to what people are increasingly kicking. But we've generated synthetic data as well to train these models. So we can take a product corpus, a product feed, product database, and we can actually transform reverse generate queries that can help us start to train the query.
Wow.
Data.
So it becomes self-training to a degree because you've obviously got a base corpus of data across all of the websites that you service. And so there are certain inferences that you can gather across all those sites and they come into a central. Now, obviously, you don't have to share specific data of a website to be able to start to create linkages and inferences in the language model. Every one of your clients, I understand they've got their own sequestered data set that doesn't get shared across other merchants. I get that. However, the learnings that you get from that can be shared and jointly used across the entire data set. But then I think what you're saying, if I understand you correctly, is that not only are there vertical specific tuning that needs to happen, but then there are site-specific tunings that need to happen in real time on an ongoing basis. This is not a one-and-done scenario. This is a constant feedback loop improvement and optimization scenario.
Yep. You can envisage if you have this three-dimensional pane where you've got your headphone products all relatively close to each other and your vacuum cleaners all relatively close to each other, their position in that space is jiggling based on what it's learning about those products. And as queries that people are entering onto those websites develop and we get new ones, we'll start to understand as well, like where do those queries in that three-dimensional space relative to those items. The only thing is it's not three-dimensional space. I think we've got over 700 dimensions in our vector model. So you can't even like picture that as a human. I mean, at least I can't. So.
Yeah, we can't hold it all in our little brains in comparison because we don't have infinite compute and we don't have infinite memory, which cloud does. And I would assume that the other super exciting thing about this is that, for example, it used to be most search and merge technology was pretty dumb in the sense that, let's say, no human being would tie together the fact that if I am prepared to shell out, so let's say I'm on an electronics website that also sells small appliances, to use your example, because this happens a lot, right? We've got maybe a department store that has home electronics and it's got small appliances all on the same website. That's very common. But historically, we as humans wouldn't, even as professional merchandisers, because I've had to do merchandising on e-commerce websites before, and you had to do custom tunings and custom search results and all those sorts of things. It's painful, but I would never normally associate, for example, if I'm prepared as a customer to go out and spend $350 or $500 on a pair of Beats headphones, that I'm also likely to be a buyer of a $2,500 Dyson stick vac. But AI can tell that. And it can not only tell it by the way that I frame my queries, because most likely, if I'm a high net worth buyer, the way that I'm going to search is going to be different to a discount buyer. The way that I ask questions, the way that I even formulate my search queries is going to be different. My query type is going to be very different. The way I navigate the site is going to be very different. If I am out for a bargain, I'm going to go straight to the discount section or the on special section of the website. I'm going to go straight there and I'm going to look at only those products. I'm going to filter by brands that I know are cheaper. I'm going to take all sorts of actions that are going to indicate that I'm perhaps a discount shopper that is going to have a naturally high propensity to buy on a discount versus a full price shopper. And we can infer all of that information through lots of different vectors or inputs, for using a better term that people will understand. Input data, that both zero and first party data, that explicit information we give plus the inferred information, that is going to allow us at scale now, using these large language models, to cross-sell, upsell, recommend, modify menuing. It allows us to change that entire experience in ways that, as a human merchandiser, I wouldn't even think of joining those dots together.
Yeah. It's beyond something you could build rules around, right? Like your experience with the keyword search technologies that we've had for the last 20 years, it's exact token matching. It's understanding what you're going to class as a token. Is it the full phrase? Is it parts of the phrase? It's having to do exact matches. It's understanding where fuzziness or misspellings can be acceptable and where they can't be. For example, if you're doing a SKU search, it needs to be exact match. You don't want similar SKUs, right? You want the exact match SKU. You're then building this sort of horrific tangled web of synonym rules around it to try to identify. Somebody might search skirt rather than dress or something like that, but I still want this item to come back. And then I won't name any names, but there are still retailers that for their top 100, 300, 500 search terms have literally got manual hardcode redirects to landing pages they're manually curating, which is...
I think this is the norm still. I think this is 100%, at least in my experience, I think this is 100% the norm. I remember when I was still doing merchandising for site search optimization, the first report that I would go to once per week is the products or the queries with no results. That's the first list that I would go to. Then from there, I would go to our top 10 queries with results, and I would then look at those results and I would see whether they were actually relevant. So even though they might have technically been relevant, I would use my mental intelligence as a human being to further refine those results and make them even more relevant than the machine learning was able to do.
And then you risk, if you've overfitted rules to lead to a query leading to specific results, do you end up creating downstream issues somewhere else for a different application or use case? And even if you fix the consumer problem, the merch team who are using the website to find products, it isn't working the way they want it to work.
Or how about if my catalog changes and I add new products and I add new categories and subcategories? If I completely fundamentally change the structure of my data and the volume of my data, then all of a sudden these optimizations get out of date pretty damn quick, don't they?
Totally. It's completely unsustainable. Now, I appreciate there is room for curation. right? There is room for a high-end fashion website to still want to curate experiences. But search is such a hyperdimensional problem. And I think that people underestimate the problem that keyword search is. Let me also say that we've spoken a bit about synonyms, but what about when something isn't a synonym, right? What about when something is your meaning might not be looking for a synonym? I'll give you an example. So if you go onto an art website and you search for nature, right, you're expecting to see pictures of waves and trees and mountains and animals, but none of those words are synonyms for the word nature. So you couldn't hard code the match there, unless you maybe build this manual redirect and landing page. But the large language technology allows us to actually already know that because through the entire text corpus of, say, Wikipedia, that oceans and trees and forests and mountains and animals are often spoken about in the same context as nature. They're closer together in vector space. So all of a sudden, you're going to get much more relevant results. And what we see with ATS, having been running the keyword search on these, there are still zero search results, but they're usually like 3 characters and gobbledygook and things that are actually returning zero search results now. We are rescuing the vast majority, over 9%, I would say, of actual useful terms people are putting in, because we're now returning relevant results to them based on the intent of their search. And that is without someone on the retailer's side having to go in and build all these complex rule sets and fudge for the results that they wish they could see and review these extensive zero search result lists and try to build synonym or redirect solutions, which is just not sustainable. Not how it's going to be in the rest of the century.
And I guess when we start to think about just to run with your example, when we start to think about a large language model versus a machine vision driven model, or in combination with a machine vision driven model. So let's run with your nature example. So I'm on an art website. I type in nature and I'm expected to see birds and bees and mountains and streams and all the rest. A large language model is going to know that. However, historically, what hasn't been possible, unless the merchant had very good structured data associated with those products that it then could link together through that large language model, you still would get poor results. For example, if I hadn't, for example, put animal as a filterable structured piece of data against every piece of art in my library, and then, for example, so that when I was in the nature category, if I wanted to filter by an animal type, and let's say I had animals with lions and bears and birds and fish, and I could filter manually by those, which means I had applied those attributes to those products, a large language model on its own doesn't get it done. And so it has to have vectors to be able to key off of. And if there's no data to vector off of, you have a problem. However, what we do have nowadays is machine vision, which can electronically look at a picture of a mountainscape and a bird in a tree and a lion lying down in savannah, and it can apply. It knows automatically what it's seeing. It sees that it's a mountainscape, it sees that there's a tree, it sees that there's a bird, and it sees that there's a lion, all in the same picture, and it can apply and create dynamically structured data that historically has required a human being to add, to see, to recognize, and to create a manual mental model of those structured data attributes to be able to then apply.
Yeah, you're exactly right. If you haven't indexed or you don't have the metadata, then how can something be discovered, right? If it doesn't exist, so how can it be created? Where keyword search is trying to match exact words or tokens or strings of words with specific indexed data points, the vector search model, the ATS, is actually just turning a sequence of attributes into a sentence for that item, and that's how it's actually putting that sentence in vector space. But to your point, so interestingly, I don't know if you know this, we actually built a visual search product back in 2019. There was a site, SYTE and Visons, that were some money, and we thought, oh wow, like visual search is the next big thing. And we built this awesome visual search product. We had sneaker search, we had dresses, floral maxi dresses. It was amazing. But guess what? No one's in the habit of going onto a website and uploading photos to find what they're looking for, or very infrequently. It just wasn't used. So we still have it today. If you go on Surf Stitch and you go to look at a dress out of stock in your size, it's got a see similar. That uses the visual search to find visually similar items. There's all sorts of applications. But exactly to your point, that's where we cut our teeth. How can that then be applied to add to that 700 dimension textual basis to further infer information? And let me tell you, like Meta released a visual search computer vision model, I think about a month or two ago. And the difference between when we built our visual search models and product in 2019 and now to do object detection accurately is a world, right? Like the depth that you can go into for that object detection is just incredible. It knows the difference of lapel.
And you know how they got that, where Meta got this, and I read this story, I can't remember where I read it, but one of the reasons why Meta made Facebook Market free was to get humans to upload images of products to describe those products so that then that could be used to train their image model database at scale without them having to pay people to do it. So basically, they trained it on the largest global cohort, or one of the largest global cohorts of product and image associated data on the planet.
Yeah. It's the value of data IP and that captive data set is just that's where the value is, right? It's not in the models. The models become commodity. But that is incredible what they've done. I don't know that we have a consumer product as well, SimilarInc.com. It's an extension that does price comparison as you're browsing the web. Fully anonymous data. We don't track anything about the individual, but even that data is allowing us to infer implicit cross-site click streams and query click data from what people are searching and then clicking on, well, the Chrome extension. So similar thing, right? You have these ancillary data strategies that you want to further improve the model's vertical tuning.
And somebody like an Ocular, for example, also they're based out of Oz. What they've done, and I guess what your machine vision is effectively doing behind the scenes as well. What they've done is they have created basically effectively a plugin to your data that takes machine vision and then converts that into explicit structured data and tags products with the correct attributes that should apply to that product. So if I have an A-line skirt that's black with white polka dots, then the base color will be assigned black, and then it'll have another structured attribute pattern polka dot, for example. And what that allows merchandisers to do is to auto tag and auto create structured data where there isn't any at scale, without them having to do 100% of it manually. Now, you still need a curator. You still need an editor who goes through and makes sure that those auto-assigned attributes are 100% correct and accurate in the way that humans normally think about things, but it's the 80-20 rule. If it can do 80% of it, then it means the merchandiser only has to do 20% of it. And so I guess behind the scenes, although your machine vision may not necessarily be used directly to create things like facets and filters in a category, what it does do is it enhances the vectors for search data, for query data, and linking of query data with visually defined attributes that then, we now know, they visited this category, but they visited this product, and this product now has these attributes. And now after that, they didn't add that to cart, but then they went to this other category and they added this other thing to the cart. We now have more vectors of data to track at scale that we couldn't do as a human being.
Yeah. And everything is an optional thing that you can further train a search model with. You don't need all of that out of the box necessarily, but in some instances you may do. And it's just thinking about, as you say, what additional data points do we need to index or add into the sentence? Do we need to go and use any of the visual vectors to further change the actual, how we're allowing search or color search or things like that? I think that's what's so exciting about the space, though, is that it's so fast moving and there's so many things you could do, and you make these little tweaks and suddenly the model just makes a leap forward in its efficacy, and it's really exciting. It's a really cool thing to be working on.
Yeah, I was listening to a podcast today. I was listening to This Week in Startups with Jason Calacanis. I'm a big fan of Jason Calacanis. I think he covers some stuff, and he's been focusing on AI for the last 6 months or so. And so he's had a lot of AI luminaries on his podcast. He had this guy on today, and I forget his name, but he's been working in the tech space for many years as a computer scientist and AI researcher. And what he said is that, funnily enough, when they look at the data points that the typical human brain trains on and the vectors that the normal human brain trains on as a child, that allows us to create a modern, what we would call an adult human being neural net that allows us to be sentient in the way that we understand sentience today through the human lens. He said, what's funny about that is, he said AI and large language models only became good when we were able to introduce as many base data points as we infer from the human brain. He said, once we got to that level, he said, you can see it. He goes, you can see, he goes, because I've been working in AI since back in the day when it wasn't even called AI, but we were doing large data sets. We were working across large data sets and making large inferences. This is going back 15, 20 years ago when he was working at IBM and et cetera. And he said, what's interesting? He goes, it's very interesting that only when we got to the point where we could inform these large language models with data points, vectors, and data sets that were as large as the human brain is typically exposed to before we reach adulthood. He said that is almost exactly the point in time where AI became as useful as it is right now in the last 6 months. He said up until then, we didn't have the compute power. We didn't have large enough data cohorts that were publicly accessible at scale and relatively cheaply. We didn't have memory capacity that was cheap enough to be able to make those connections and refresh them regularly in a indexable database. He said basically all of these things came together at about the same time to facilitate us creating AI models that learn in an almost identical way that the human brain forms and develops and learns into adulthood. And I thought that was profound. Is effectively what we've created is a supercharged version of the human brain that learns at an exponentially faster rate than a human brain does, and creating those artificial synapses and interconnections that the human brain takes 20 years to create, we now create it in seconds, minutes, or days.
Yeah, and it seems to be what a lot of the media is doing, a bit of fear mongering around as well, that concept. It's a great narrative as well, right? Because we only understand our own intelligence, and we only expect our own intelligence. So when a machine is capable of responding to us in a way that seems equally capable but more knowledgeable, that's impressive. It's exciting. What are your views on this thing around AI?
Look, it's you raise a very good question, and I'll make this the question, because normally I wait till the end to turn the mic over and let you ask me a question, but no, that's great. This is fantastic. You've beat me to the punch, which is great. I think that absolutely, I believe that AI is the only existential threat that we as humans have. That's it. And I did a dedicated podcast about this back in 2019, and I think it was December of 2019, that I think is as relevant today as it was when I recorded it. It was a solo podcast, and I basically was just pontificating about AI, and this was long before ChatGPT ever came onto the field. And I basically called it AI, Holy Grail, or Hell on Earth. That was the name of the podcast episode. And I think it's a potential
nature, or?
I am absolutely an optimist by nature, and that's why I think that almost every other challenge we face as a species is relatively straightforward and solvable given our application of intelligence, our own intelligence and technology. I think that almost all of those are solvable. I think that AI is the riskiest one, only because if we build AI to the point where it is as quote unquote sentient as a human is, or as we recognize humans to be today, then we will have by definition created a technology that can create its own agenda, can create its own goals, can create its own intent, and when I hear people say, oh no, that can never happen because we have AI ethics, and this is being talked about everywhere. And I think, and what I brought out in this podcast is, we can't even agree on the age of consent globally. Age of consent ranges, depending on the country, from the age of 12 to the age of 18. Okay? So if we can't all agree on what should be the age of consent, then how the hell are we ever going to agree on a common set of AI ethics? And even if we generally do, and 80% of people that work with AI agree on a same set of ethics, there's going to be 20% of people out there that don't give a fuck. And they're going to be like, we're going to create whatever ethical framework we can to get ahead and make more money and control the world. So I definitely think that I'm just generally, broadly, in an umbrella sense, very positive about technology and improving people's lives around the world. I think if there's any existential threat to humanity, it is AI. And I brought up the context around what Elon Musk said. It was the ant problem. He talked about at one point, when humans go and they build a superhighway, they don't kill 1 billion ants because they hate ants. They kill 1 billion ants because they're trying to build a highway, and bulldozers kill 1 billion ants. And so that's what I almost think of with AI. It's like we would never set out to destroy the world with AI, but AI could create a outcome based on its own agenda that it builds of itself to program itself, that it may not kill 1 billion humans because it hates humans. It may kill 1 billion humans just because it's trying to build a road.
Purpose. Yeah.
Correct. So that's the only thing. That's the only thing I think about.
Do you think a lot of the press at the moment serves the purposes of those in founder or executive, sort of the opportunity to make money essentially from AI? This fear mongering,
100%, 100%. And I think that obviously with Elon Musk and OpenAI and from Microsoft to Google to Apple, the reality is them all calling for AI legislation. It's all self-serving. The reality is that they will be able to, not only will they shape the legislation if it's ever passed, but they will be able to uniquely be able to afford to implement whatever legislation is required. And so therefore they by definition are building a bigger moat for themselves, and everyone else who's smaller than them who would have to comply with whatever regulation. It may become so cost prohibitive to comply. It's almost like the GDPR, right? I think the GDPR is a complete joke. And I think that some of the biggest companies in the world, what is the saying? Thou dost protest too much. The reality is Google loves the GDPR because A, they don't have to comply. They'll just pay a fine. Facebook doesn't care. They don't need to comply because they'll just pay a fine. B, it creates barriers to entry for any of their competitors who can't pay the fine. So they have to ultimately comply or go out of business. And so therefore it handicaps their competitors. So the reality is that legislation has never been able to, in my experience, I don't even like to say, but nearly 50 years on this planet, the reality is I have never seen legislation be able to keep up effectively with technology. Never. I haven't seen a good example of it ever. And I think there's a lot of unintended consequences as a result of that legislation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's interesting. I don't think my adaptive transformer search product is going to go and build a superhighway anytime soon. So I suppose I'm far less worried at the current point in time just because the technology is impressive. But I'm sure there are much bigger, deeper pocket players that are working on far more dangerous and autonomous concepts. Yeah, I think that some of the things you read about around the US military and some of the applications there from Palantir and things, that's probably where there's a little bit more focus on ethics required versus e-commerce site search.
But I love it. Look, I'm a big fan of commerce. And at the end of the day, I think when we make the jump, I think that unfortunately FTX and all the crypto grifts and everything else, I think they've set back the adoption of Web3 and crypto by at least a decade. And that's a shame because I think that VR is the next computing platform. I think that it is the future of the internet. I think it is the next generation internet. And unfortunately, a whole bunch of crypto boys ruined it for us all. And so we've set that back by at least a decade, probably more like 20 years. And CBDCs and everything else are going to come first now. And there's going to be regulation up the wazoo and everything else. But having said all that, I think that the reality is I have a vision for commerce everywhere. And whether that happens in my lifetime or not, it's going to eventually happen to where literally every single thing with
quick discovery, contextual relevance.
It's going to be everywhere. It's literally going to be everywhere. And, it's going to start with platforms like Netflix, which in real time, if you turn it on inside when you're watching a movie, for example, it's going to be a steady stream ticker at the bottom of the screen of every single thing on the screen that you can visually see that you then can immediately buy, from the jacket that somebody's wearing to the glasses that they're wearing to the table in the background to literally the picture on the wall to absolutely everything you can see in every single scene in real time. They will have a stream ticker of e-commerce along the bottom where you can literally in the app, you can tap it, you can buy it. It will have all your payment details stored and it will just turn up at your doorstep.
To support this as well, our Chrome extension, SimilarInc, already, if you're going and watching a YouTube product review, it will run the product search for you based on the review that you're watching.
Wow. See, and this is coming, right?
Exactly.
And we're going to see almost everything is going to become touchable. Everything is going to become interactable. It will identify you as you walk past based on either your phone or likely by that stage it'll be a chip in your hand to your forehead, unfortunately. But it's all coming. That's the reality. It's all coming. From things that were sci-fi 10, 20 years ago, that sci-fi stuff, the Jetsons level stuff, is all going to be the norm, and AI and machine vision and machine learning are all going to facilitate this. But thank you. First of all, I want to thank you for pushing the boundaries of what commerce can be today, and personalization can be today using technology right here, right now. Merchants don't have to wait. They don't have to wait for pie in the sky stuff where they have to custom integrate Amazon AI into their website. They don't have to do a whole bunch of custom integration, try to figure out how AI works for them. They today can consume AI directly through technologies and platforms like yours and they don't have to custom develop a thing. They basically plug it in and it just works. And I've said this for many years.
Switch out the API endpoint and it's better.
Exactly. And I have said this for a long time that I think 99.9% of the merchants in the world now and in the future will consume AI via the platform partners that they work with. They will not integrate AI directly into anything. So sure, if you're Walmart or if you're Amazon or whatever, then of course you're going to be building your own AI models. You're going to be building your own AI technology, completely bespoke and plugging it in and completely making something that is totally unique to your brand. But that's not 99.9% of merchants out there. 99.9% of merchants out there, they want to sell shit. They want to buy stuff. They want to create stuff. They want to curate stuff. They want to market it effectively, and they want to get it in front of potential buyers in as friction-free a way as possible. And that's as far as their AI aspirations go. And so congratulations on introducing a really relevant and applicable, and I think super practical version of AI into your platform in terms of bringing in search that is much more human-like in nature, in the way that it almost thinks about search. This is much more, instead of trying to shoehorn these short little human queries into direct keyword matches, now making it much more contextual in nature by definition. I think that I think is where platforms like yours really start to bring immediate, literally flip a light switch and turn it on value for merchants. So freaking well done, mate. Congratulations.
Thanks, Jason. Much appreciated.
And I always enjoy our conversations. And look, I know this is episode number 2 for you. I hope we get to have episode 3, 4, 5, 10 in another couple of years. I'm hoping that instead of 230 episodes, I'm at 330 and 430. This is the culmination of my life's work. This podcast right here is my love letter back to the industry. And I've been doing this, I'm in my 23rd year of doing this internet thing. And I probably get more joy out of creating content in our space with people like yourself and having these kinds of conversations. It's one of the things that brings me more joy than just about anything else. And I love consulting. I love that. And look, everybody's got to make a living and everybody's got to find a way to monetize their skills and experience. But in terms of something that just brings me sheer joy, having these kind of conversations with people like yourself that are at the cutting edge of this whole thing, I truly enjoy it, and I hope I get to do it until I'm dead. Are you a B2B or D2C e-commerce merchant? Then head over to greenwoodconsulting.net to learn how we can help you scale your business.